Hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly videocast and podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, founder of Migraine Nation, and I had chronic daily migraine from the age of 4 to the age of 30. So today is a special day. I am here with Alicia Wolf, known to most of us as the Dizzy Cook. Hi, Alicia, how you doing today?
Hi, thank you. I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here.
So today is going to be really fun. We are talking about migraine, but we are also cooking. By we, I mean Alicia is cooking. Nobody wants me to cook. You can see I'm sitting in my normal spot because if I also cooked, we would be here an extra hour. I'm not exactly talented in the kitchen, but I like to eat, not necessarily cook. So Alicia has a new book out. This is her second cookbook. The new one is called The Mediterranean Migraine Diet, and she is going to tell us about it while she shows us how to cook something festive and amazing. I'll let her tell you what it is. I'm really excited. I helped pick it out because I knew it was something my family and I would love to eat. So, Alicia, why don't you go ahead and tell us what we're making today?
Sure. So today we're actually making a recipe, a version of a recipe from my first cookbook, The Dizzy Cook.
Okay.
It's the white bean chicken chili right here. It's
Uh-huh.
super popular with a lot of my readers, and a lot of people, know how to make a white bean chicken chili, but this one's a little bit different. And actually, the recipe I'm going to make today for you is extremely different from the one in the cookbook. So I'm going to tell you how to edit it for a super lazy day, or if you are a terrible cook. So instead of making this and using blenders and doing it on the stove top today, I actually brought my crock pot because I've
Okay.
had a really rough week myself. So we're actually going to dump everything into the crock pot today, and I'm
Oh,
going to show
okay.
you how to do that. So there's really no cooking involved except for chopping and pouring things into the crock pot. I'm also going to show you how to use an immersion blender to make your life a little bit easier as well.
Oh, nice. This sounds like something
Yeah.
that even I could do,
Yes.
maybe,
I know you definitely
with some
can, and it
practice.
can, it can be made vegetarian. What I love about this recipe is it can be vegetarian. You just add more beans to it or veggies. It's already gluten free, and then you can also make it dairy free. As is, it's really dairy free itself. Sometimes I like to mix in cheese to make it a little cheesy. So
Okay.
I'll talk you guys through that as well.
Oh, sounds great. Okay,
Yeah.
so you're cooking something from your first book.
Yes.
Um, I thought I'd ask you some questions while you're cooking, if you don't mind. Are you able to chop and talk at the same time?
Yes, I am. So
Okay.
actually, well, let me walk you through this. Let's get
Okay.
started with this first.
Go ahead.
We are going to take, let me see how I can do this best. I'm going to move my crock pot bowl just right in front so you guys can see here. We are going to take 1 can of great northern beans,
Okay.
and these have been drained. If you're sensitive to salt, I know some people with vestibular migraine also have a Meniere's issue, so sometimes they're a little
Oh,
sensitive to salt. Just check for that on your ingredient list. If you can't find one without salt, you can always just drain these and rinse them really well with water, and that should
okay.
help with the sodium content as well. So we're going to add 1 can of beans to this, and then I have a little bit of homemade chicken broth left over, so I'm going to add a cup in here
Okay.
just to kind of wet that down. And then I am going to show you how to use an immersion blender. So this is a type of blender, looks like a big stick. I actually
Okay.
really love this for migraine because instead of having to dump all of this into a tall blender and then transfer that to another bowl so you have extra dishes to do, all
Mm-hmm.
you have to do is stick this in the pot right like here, and it works great for soups that you need to puree. So I'm just going to puree these beans. Whoop, got myself. Yeah, you have to be careful of the spray a little bit. It usually works better if you have more broth. Let me add a little bit more to it.
Okay.
And blend that up until it's smooth and kind of creamy. So this is a great way to make kind of a creamy soup without adding any dairy or heavy cream to it. Of course, if you want it even more creamy, you can add cheese. But we're just going to blend that up until the beans are nice and smooth in there. So I'll show you guys. You should be able to see.
When thinking of people with migraine, you think of the fact that we might not feel well enough to do a bunch of dishes after we've cooked.
Right, and you can also hear it. Like it's a lot quieter than a traditional blender too. So if you are sound sensitive, that's why I really like it too. It's just easier on the head and the ears, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Or like if you have balance issues with your migraine like me, then you're not having to carry, these big pots around from one to the next and that sort of thing. So while I talk to you, I'm going to cut up 2 shallots. The recipe actually calls for 2 leeks, but I didn't have those on hand. So I'm substituting shallots for this recipe, which are, a lot of people think they're onions, but they're not. They're in the same family as like onions and garlic, but they're actually very closely related to garlic, which is something we learn in culinary classes, that they make a great substitute for garlic. So I find they have a lot more refined flavor than onion, which they take smaller amounts. They tend to be, for people sensitive to onion, with migraine, they tend to be a good alternative. But leeks also make a great substitute here, especially with those. I know some of the community has like FODMAP restrictions and stuff like that. So green onions or leeks would also work here. So I'm just chopping this up. And one thing that I also like to show people with migraine is how to hold your knife. So you see, like I have my grip is really high on the knife versus back here. And I think a lot of people chop back here. And that, you can see, that doesn't give you a lot of control over what you're chopping. So if you hold it closer to the neck, you're going to have a lot more control. It's going to be safer for you.
In case you're dizzy or just not feeling well.
Exactly.
These are great tips. I wouldn't have thought of. Thank you for this. Is really,
of course. So I think I'm to a good place. I'm just going to chop these two, mixing these two. Garlic, just chop the ends and smash them and give them a quick mince. If you want to talk about the book really quick, and then
okay, good. I was like, can I ask questions now? Yes. So I want to start with, we're going to go back to, because I think that anyone that has not, does not know your history, it's really interesting. So I'm going to go back to your history in a minute. But first, I really want people to know about the new book and how it's different from your first book. So the new book is called The Mediterranean Migraine Diet. And your first book was The Dizzy Cook, and was more elimination based. Some of these things that trigger our migraine, you were teaching us how to eliminate them. So this second book, how's it different?
Yeah, so my first book was really based on the principles. Some people know it. I think National Headache Foundation has a really good printout on it. Some people know it as the Johns Hopkins migraine diet. Some people know it as Heal Your Headache, from Dr. Buchholz. So it goes by many different names, but basically the idea of it is to have you eliminate foods for a temporary period of time, and then you begin to bring things back in, and see if you have any personal triggers. The thing that makes it kind of tough is a lot of people get into a cycle where they think all these foods are bad, or they can't ever decipher their triggers, or maybe they don't have food triggers. And so it leaves people with a lot of confusion over, what to eat when you have migraine. And so my neurologist, Dr. Shinbei, who is now at the Bay Center for Vestibular and Migraine Disorders, he has his own practice. He approached me actually, and he said, would you be interested in writing a cookbook that's a little more science-based? And, this is what I want to discuss. I feel like there are a lot of patients who are just really lost, and they don't want to either do the full elimination, or, they haven't really been able to discover what their triggers are. And, I really wanted to have that information out there and explore it. And so I said, yeah, I'm never going to turn down a book with my neurologist,
Right.
Yeah. So we set out on this endeavor, and we talked about a lot of different diets together, and, things that had research behind them. So we talked a little bit about keto, but keto is tough to do long term as well, and it can be very restrictive as well. So after he did a lot of research, we kind of talked about doing a Mediterranean diet, but that applies to migraine. So a traditional Mediterranean diet, it's been studied for a lot of different health issues, and can be very, very helpful for brain health as well. But he kind of took a deep dive into all the little things the Mediterranean diet is made up of. So we looked at omega-3s, and, there's that study that came out about omega-3s and the balance of omega-3s and omega-6s being helpful for migraine. And so we talk about that a little bit. We look at common food triggers in the migraine community. So things like caffeine and chocolate and olives and even tomatoes, and why those may or may not be an issue. And then we give tips on, hey, if these bother you, this might be a way to better tolerate it. Like, there's some information out there. There have been studies done. There's actually been studies done on tomatoes and their high glutamate content, but there's actually certain tomatoes you can buy, and the way you cut them can actually reduce their glutamate content as well. So that was
told me that, and I was like, okay, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I can't wait to
like when I first read his writing about it, I was like, is this real? And I went online, and there's a whole study on it too, which is fascinating. Yeah. So so we have stuff like that in there in the book, as well as, different types of olives and olive oil, and, how to cook fish and get extra vegetables in your diet. And so we really focus on the foods that you should be eating for brain health versus foods to avoid. Yeah. So
that sounds very exciting to me, because I have, between myself and the fact that I'm cooking for children, when I'm cooking, often other people are helping me cook, etc. Getting vegetables in that everyone wants to eat is difficult. So I'm very excited for that part of this book.
Yeah. So that's where I come in, and I just help. I take, the principles of what he's saying and just kind of apply it to recipes. So, like one of them, and make them, family friendly like that. Like one way, if your kids hate kale, let's say, not a lot of people like kale, right? So for one of the recipes, I have I think it's 11 cups of kale in one, or 2 little fritters. But if you cook it and wilt it down, you're getting a lot of kale in one little piece. And so if you make them into little fritters that you pan fry with some olive oil and have a little dipping sauce, I think it makes it a little bit easier to get the rest of the family excited,
Right.
It's not just here's a bowl of kale.
Right.
So I'm going to add another can of beans to this, the Great Northern beans, and that'll give us some more texture.
Okay.
I'm going to add about a cup of frozen corn to this.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And frozen vegetables are great. I actually prefer to use them to can because they're a little more fresh, and they tend to taste a little bit better in soups as well. They have a little bit better texture. And then I'm going to add just a splash of olive oil to this.
Okay.
And some spices. So I have chili powder here. So we're going to do a teaspoon of chili powder to this, and that's not going to fit. So pour it out. Oh, whoops. I like to. No, thankfully it didn't all go in there. I usually eyeball it anyway. One thing to look at with your chili powder when you're shopping, especially if you're sensitive to things, like I have some people on the Dizzy Cook who are sensitive to onion and especially cocoa powder. So sometimes they'll have that in certain chili powders, and that's just something you have to be aware of and look for.
Okay.
There are lots of brands that don't contain it. So that's just something to double check, especially if you find it to be an issue for you. So we're doing 2 teaspoons of cumin, and I'm going to use a smaller. That puts in there. And then some smoked paprika. So all smoked paprika is just paprika that's the peppers have been smoked, kind of an open flame. I think that gets confusing for some people. So we're going to do 1.5 teaspoons of that. It adds like a great smoky flavor.
Okay. I don't know if that's in my kitchen. I will go look if my paprika is smoked. I might have to go pick that up.
It's not spicy, but it's a great flavor. Like I love to use it in a lot of barbecue recipes.
Okay.
Because it adds that natural flavor without like adding liquid smoke or anything, with kind of that fake flavor to it. And then, so normally in this recipe, I do jalapeno and a poblano chili. Feel free, the jalapeno is optional, like especially if you don't like spicy or that bothers, I know that can bother some people's heads. And then poblano chili. This is actually a dried pasilla pepper. And we have a really sweet lady who comes every few weeks to like help me with the house, and she's from Durango, Mexico. And so she brought me back a bunch of these dried pasilla peppers, which is just dried poblano pepper. But I'll just throw this in, and it's super flavorful, and it'll kind of absorb some of that moisture too. So when everything is cooked, it kind of plumps up, and I'll chop it, but you can just use a regular poblano pepper.
Okay.
And poblanos aren't very spicy. So for people concerned about that, it shouldn't be an issue. I'm also from Texas, so I tend to think things are like more mild, I guess, than other parts of the country, but just be aware.
Okay.
And then to finish this off, we're going to add another 2 cups of broth. So one thing I like to tell people, I do have 2 recipes in my original cookbook for an easy broth that you can make in an Instant Pot very quickly. But I understand that not everyone has the energy or the time to make their own broth.
Right.
It can be difficult to find broth without added MSG.
Okay.
Even if they say no added MSG, sometimes they'll put like natural chicken flavor or yeast extract or these things in there that to kind of get around it, that tend to bother people with like, especially who are sensitive to high glutamate. So one way around that, I like to use vegetable broth, which tends to have less things added to it. And And this one I'm a big fan of. It's from Trader Joe's. It's called Hearty Vegetable Broth. And they use onion powder instead of actual onion, which I think a lot of people in my community tend to tolerate better if they're sensitive to onion.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so something to keep in mind.
These are
I tend
great
to have
tips.
good people, like people tend to tolerate this one well. I haven't gotten too many complaints about it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's another one out there called Butcher's Bone Broth. That's pretty good, but it's
Okay.
simmered a long time. So sometimes I get complaints about that, but
Okay.
yeah, lots of options.
Okay. These
That's what
are
I like to give
amazing tips
people.
that I never like. I feel like I hear everything having to do with migraine, but these are things that I've just never heard. I
Yeah.
also want to make sure, I know you're talking about the dish, but I want to make sure that people get to hear your vestibular migraine history and
Yeah.
how you came about to writing cookbooks, and how you were helped by dietary changes. So please make sure you tell us this in case there's people watching today who don't know this history. It's so interesting to me.
Yeah. So I'll start from the beginning. I was diagnosed with chronic vestibular migraine about like 6.5 years ago, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's like flown by. But basically, when I was 30, I just turned 30 and I just gotten married, and my husband and I were traveling around. And I remember when we came back from a trip, um, I got this kind of cold, and I thought it was just from exhaustion from traveling and coming back to the, my office job and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was feeling dizzy off and on. And all these doctors were telling me, oh, you're just stressed at work. You're just, it's just anxiety. And I kept getting pushed off. And I saw some of the best. I saw some of the top ENTs in Dallas. I saw some of the top neurologists in
Mm-hmm.
Dallas. And no one, everyone was kind of gaslighting me, to be honest, and
Mm-hmm.
just telling me it was all in my head. I went to the ER one night with a vertigo attack, and they diagnosed me with literally vertigo, which is a symptom, not a diagnosis,
Right.
and sent me home with meclizine. And, you know, I was getting to the point where I couldn't drive anymore. I could not look at my computer at work. I was losing my job, and I couldn't get FMLA accommodations, and especially short-term disability, when everyone was just telling me I'm just stressed out. Like, what am I supposed to do? Tell my employer that?
Right.
And so it got to the point where I just had a meltdown, and I reached out on Facebook and I was like, can anyone help me? And one of our friends knew a doctor. oh, Well, one of the vestibular therapists I was seeing pretty regularly, who never mentioned vestibular migraine to me, um, suggested I might have a perilimb fistula, and that I had a torn. Basically, it's like your inner ear gets a little torn,
Mm-hmm.
and so our friend had a doctor at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona who was like a perilimb fistula expert, and so I went. We drove out there 16 hours because I couldn't fly, and he walked in after 2 days of testing me. He was like, you have migraine. I
Mm-hmm.
was like, no, I don't get head pain and
Yeah.
or a headache. I'm sure I said headaches at the time, thinking like, oh, that's all migraine is.
Right.
And he was like, no, actually there's like so many symptoms that come with migraine, and light sensitivity and sound sensitivity is one of them. And you actually don't have to have headache to be diagnosed with vestibular migraine. It causes dizziness and vertigo and all these things you're experiencing. And it was about that time I had heard about this dizzy doctor in Dallas, who's my current doctor, Dr. Bay, but he diagnosed these like unexplained cases, and you went to him if you were a really difficult case. And so he happened to have a cancellation the week after, and I saw him, and he was like, oh yeah, it's vestibular migraine. So
Right.
after having two doctors that I felt like really knew and understood and were giving me these explanations, I was like, okay, I have to trust this is my diagnosis. So Dr. Bay and I started working on a plan together. But what was interesting and unique about me was because I was looking to start a family soon. And so I know that's hard to fathom when you're sick and you can't drive and you
Right.
are like in a constant state of chronic migraine.
But there's
But it
so
was
many
still,
people that's what the stage of life you're at. I mean, it's
yeah,
right.
yeah. And so, you know, I said, look, like originally before this happened to me, like we were going to start trying for a family, and I don't know how long I want to put this off. And, or like, you know, what's the timeline here? He's like, well, I can't really give you a timeline. You know, migraine's
Mhm.
so unique. And he said, you know, we can try to work on a plan where you are, where you have a lot of opportunities to use natural treatments for support. So we discussed certain medications I could be on during pregnancy or leading up to pregnancy. At the time, a lot of the new medications that are out now in the devices weren't a thing back
Right.
then. And
Mhm.
so we came up with a plan for that, and I got on supplements. But one thing we discussed was nutrition and diet, and which I don't think a lot of doctors discuss with you.
Mhm.
So we went through a few of the diets out there, and I did a lot of my own research. And at the time, the one that was really popular was this Johns Hopkins migraine diet. And um, so I thought, you know, this seems hard and complicated, but it's nothing I can't do. And I have a background in cooking, and I've taken culinary immersion classes all over the world, and it's always been a love of mine. I've just never
Mhm.
made it into a career.
Right.
And so I really started doing this diet, and I started writing down. I'd go grocery shopping, which was very hard for me, but I'd read all the labels and kind of stockpile what I thought would fit into it, and started making these recipes and would get frustrated that like none of my favorite recipes work. So I was like, okay, how do I edit these to work for this diet? And so I realized that over time I was getting better at recipe development and creating my own things and working with different flavors that I had never typically used before. And I
Right.
thought, oh, this would be great to share with, like, wouldn't it be fun to have like a fun food blog that people could go to
Right.
where they could just be on this diet, but it would seem like fun, and they could have like all these great recipes in one place, and they wouldn't have to worry about what to shop for, what brands to buy. So that's how the Dizzy Cook came about.
Was there a specific, or were there specific dietary changes that helped you with your vestibular
Yeah.
migraine?
Yeah. So I really think doing the elimination really helped me a lot.
Mhm.
I didn't see it at first, which I think happens to a lot of people. So I wasn't I was taking notes in a journal on kind of what I was eating every day, and I wasn't seeing patterns really because I was still stuck in that daily dizziness. And so what I
Mhm.
was failing to realize was like my vertigo attacks had gone away. My light sensitivity had decreased a ton. And
Hmm.
it wasn't until one night that uh, I was like, this diet is stupid. I've been on it 2 months. I don't feel like, I'm still dizzy every day. And doing all these meds and everything else, like I just got really
Yeah.
frustrated. And I remember trying yogurt that night, and I used to eat yogurt every day for breakfast, and I could never tell that it bothered me before. I just was always dizzy. And I
Mhm.
remember that night I got a vertigo attack. And I hadn't
Oh,
had one in months. And I said, oh gosh, like I haven't had a vertigo attack in months. Like, how did I miss that? You know, like,
right.
but it wasn't until it happened again that it came to the front of my mind. And I was like, okay, maybe there is something to this diet, and potentially yogurt could be a trigger for me. And, you know, six, about 6 months in, I really started having dizzy-free days.
Oh,
So I
really?
don't, yeah, yeah. So I don't just credit the diet. I think it was that final piece that I was really missing, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to say that it was just the diet because I was really doing a lot of other things. I think it was
Mm-hmm.
just that was the final missing piece for me
Right.
that really took me to those 100% days. And I actually went into remission for about two to 2.5 years until I started doing IVF again. And then even now, I'm more episodic. Like I'll maybe have passing dizziness. Like if my trigger load gets too high, I'll have passing dizziness for like a day or half a day, but it's nowhere near where I used to be. Like I can still drive and,
Right.
you know, only time I've had a vertigo attack since I was in labor.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so I think that
Nice.
was the stressful. I hadn't eaten for like 24 hours. You have the lights. I was like, oh, that,
Right.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But I can relate to that because I know the
Yeah.
feeling of just daily. I had daily migraine from the time I was 4, and I also
Yeah.
developed CRPS on the side of my face and head and neck where the migraine was. And when you break that daily pattern, it's like a
Yeah.
whole new world. So it's interesting to me, like when you say that you
Yeah.
did go into remission from the daily dizziness, but I'm curious, can you, before you go back to finishing what you were doing, can, for the people in
Yeah.
our audience who don't know the difference between a vertigo attack and the daily dizziness you're speaking of, can you explain that for us?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. So every day I felt lightheaded, um, like my brain just wasn't all there. I had a lot of brain fog, which is
Mm-hmm.
sort of like you try to recall words and you can't think of the name, or your brain just feels cloudy, or like you'll spend 5 minutes looking at the straw and you'll be like that thing that you suck the water out of, like it just
Mm-hmm.
words can't come to you.
Right.
um, Sometimes I felt like my head was going to like pop off and float away, or I felt like very disconnected from the world around me.
Mm-hmm.
One of the sensations I would feel a lot was like walking on marshmallows or clouds. Like I felt like I didn't have any stable floor underneath me. And
Mm-hmm.
then the vertigo attacks were more like, I mean, I think traditionally doctors um, kind of define it as traditional spinning. So either you feel like you're spinning
Mm-hmm.
or the world around you feels like you're spinning. But vertigo can kind of be a little tricky because some of my attacks would be like, I was sitting in the car one time and I slammed on my brakes thinking I was moving forward,
Oh.
and I was actually like just sitting still. So,
Oh, okay,
yeah.
yeah.
So you just feel movement that's not there. And
Okay.
that can also kind of fall under the vertigo diagnosis too. So sometimes
Okay.
people feel like they're dropping or sinking into the couch. It's a really, really scary,
Yeah, no,
crazy
that I can see what you're
feeling.
saying would
Yeah.
be very frustrating. I have had a few migraines with vertigo attacks, but it's not the
Yeah.
norm for me. So I learn a lot by having you explain. I had one where I fell directly onto my face and needed stitches, but that's the main vertigo attack that I remember. It's
Yeah.
not my norm at
It's
all.
dangerous.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
mine always
Yeah.
came with pain. So I don't, yeah.
Okay.
But I love that you explained, because I think most people who that's not the norm for them, they don't know the difference between dizziness and a vertigo attack.
For
So thank you
sure.
for doing that. You can go ahead and finish your explanation for us so that we can all make this at home.
Oh, sure. So I just have this in my crock pot, and all I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
do is set this on low for like, 2 to 3, cover it and
Mm-hmm.
set this on low for like 2 to 3 hours.
Oh,
And
wow.
then
Okay.
once that's done, like let's say you're making this vegetarian,
Right.
what I would do is maybe mix in you could do some zucchini or squash towards the end and just cook it
Oh,
for like another 15 minutes or 20 minutes, it will soften a little bit, but you don't want to cook it now because it'll get too mushy. But or I'll mix in what I like to call naked rotisserie chicken. So what I mean by naked chicken is just a rotisserie chicken that's been cooked with salt, pepper, and olive oil. Sometimes they have nothing in them. Usually you can find these at like Sprouts, Whole Foods. Here in Texas, we can get them at HEB, Central Market. Usually like kind of like the healthier grocery stores, they have them. And they're typically not injected with solutions, and they don't have MSG added to them, which can be tough to find with rotisserie chickens. Yeah, and I also have a recipe on my website. They're really easy to make at home. And so if you want to save a little money, you can actually get a bigger whole chicken and cook that. It takes about an hour to cook, but doesn't require a lot of skill either. I know some people are intimidated by chicken. But if you go on my website, it'll show you exactly how to make it. You can make it in a cast iron pan, and then just pick off all the meat and stir that in here. So that way you have chicken in here. You could also just cut up like a raw chicken breast and let this cook a little bit longer. I'd say about 3 hours, 3.5 hours, and then just make sure it's cooked through. But yeah, that's a good way to add some protein to it too.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds so yummy. I can't wait to try it.
Yeah. And then if you need to add a little pinch of salt or whatever, I would look at the sodium content of your broth, whatever broth you're using. Sometimes you don't need the extra salt, but yeah, that's it.
I would like my daughter Skylar, who's been listening. She's the one that would probably help me cook this. Come, she's gonna poke her head in and say hello. She's always wanted to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you too.
We have little things marked in your first book. So yeah, so she wanted to say hi. So thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else?
One to make, right?
Is there anything else that you would like to add about today's dish before we go?
No, again, you can find the basic recipe in the Dizzy Cook cookbook, which is available almost everywhere books are sold. I also have signed copies of that and the Mediterranean Migraine Diet on my website, thedizzycookshop.com. But yeah, you can go back and reference this video for all the edits you need. You can see how it's super versatile. And I'm also around on social media. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and just shoot me a message if you're like, oh, I can't have this, but I can have this. If you want to know how to add cheese, I would suggest at the end, I would do maybe like 3 ounces of stir in 3 ounces of cream cheese until it's like fully mixed in, and that'll make it kind of creamy. Or you can do good quality American cheese, which melts really well. By good quality, I don't mean like the Kraft singles. There are brands, there's 2 brands, Andrew and Everett is a good brand, as well as Boar's Head, and you can usually get those from the deli, but they'll cut off big chunks for you back there instead of the sliced thin slices for burgers. And with those, they don't have all the same additives to them. They have they're just a combination of really young unaged cheddar and unaged Colby Jack cheese. So that's good to know if you are sensitive to aged cheese.
And so many of us are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a great. So you add the cheese at the very, very end.
At the very end, yeah, and just let it kind of melt in there for about 5 minutes, and then it'll get nice and creamy and juicy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you everyone for being with us today, and join us again next week for the weekly video cast and podcast of the National Headache Foundation. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.